Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Contested Rural Environment series. My name is Professor Sarah Skerritt and I'm the Chief Exec here at the RSE. And I'm very excited to be chairing the session today, particularly given the quality of the speakers and of course you as attendees. I have a rural research background myself and therefore I feel even more privileged to be chairing these seminars. As Scotland's National Academy, the RSE's mission is to make knowledge useful. And this series, which will be running over 5 weeks, will be addressing 5 key issues that impact rural communities and environments in Scotland. Each week, we'll be speaking with 2 experts who will be discussing the issues and potential solutions around the following topics: land use change and restoring nature, energy futures, tourism, housing and population retention, health and social care, heritage and regional identity. This series builds on the recent Islands Past, Present and Future events, which highlighted some of the themes we're taking forward through this discussion. All events will be available to watch on the RSE YouTube channel every Thursday from 12 noon till 1 p.m. until Thursday the 3rd of April, with the recordings available to watch after each event. We'll be answering questions from you, the audience, throughout the session. Please submit any questions that you have in the chat function on YouTube. And just so you know, there's almost 400 of you watching today, which is really exciting. Just to let you know the format before I introduce our brilliant speakers, we're going to have about 5 minutes each from each speaker, and I'll be timing them. Then there'll be a Q&A, and then we are asking Professor Roger Crofts to do the summing up, and we will finish at 1 p.m. sharp. So I'm now going to give you a little bit of biog on our speakers, and then they'll have their 5 minutes to set out their stall. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Annie Tindley, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Professor of British and Irish Rural History at the University of Newcastle. Annie has been Professor of British and Irish Rural History since 2020 and the head of the School of History, Classics and Archaeology. She joined the university in Newcastle in September 2016 and from December 2017 to December 2020 was the Consortium Director for the AHRC Northern Bridge Consortium Doctoral Training Partnership. Annie completed her MA in 2001, an MSc by Research in 2002, and a PhD in 2006 in History at the University of Edinburgh. Annie's held posts at the Universities of Aberdeen, Glasgow Caledonian, and University of Dundee. So welcome, Annie. Professor Pat Monaghan is a Fellow of the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. She's an ecologist whose research focuses on ecology, animal life histories, and conservation. Her multidisciplinary work examines the ways in which environmental conditions can influence animals at individual and population levels. She's worked mainly with birds, including species of conservation concern in Scotland. Pat was recently one of the co-authors of an RSE inquiry into public financial support for tree planting and forestry. She's served on boards, councils and committees of several governmental and non-governmental conservation bodies. And before we get cracking, I'm just going to introduce Professor Roger Crofts, who's going to give the summary at about 10 to 1 today. He's the convener of a community of interest here at the RSE on the environment. Roger began his career as an academic geographical scientist, specialising in mapping and assessment of natural resources in Scotland. He spent most of his working career as a government advisor and administrator in the Scottish Government and as founder chief exec of Scottish Natural Heritage. In retirement, Roger works internationally in Iceland and in Scotland. His areas of special interest and expertise are governance, strategic planning and implementation in charities, protecting nature, including geoconservation, and advocating more environmentally effective use of management of land and natural resources. He's written and spoken widely about these areas. In addition, Roger was secretary to the RSE's inquiry into energy issues in Scotland and the RSE's committee of inquiry into the future of Scotland's hills and islands. Most recently, he chaired RSE's Brexit and Environment Working Group, which produced a well-received advisory paper. Roger's work has been recognised by numerous awards internationally in the UK and in Scotland from national governments, universities and professional institutions. So now that I've whetted your appetite and by reading out these summaries, I'm going to hand over firstly to Professor Annie Tindley for your 5 minutes. Please, Annie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and no pressure being in such honourable company. And I'd just like to thank you, Sarah and Roger and everyone at the RSE for the invitation, and a huge thanks also to Pat. It's a great honour to be on this discussion with you. So keeping an eye on the time then. So as Sarah said, I'm a historian of rural Scotland, and I think when we use the word environment, and in this context, contested rural environments, we tend to assume we are discussing our physical and natural landscapes and environments. But I think to understand why rural Scotland is such a contested space, we need to include our internal and collective cultural, historical, spiritual, and social environments in that discussion too. I think that these are often in tension with each other, and usually kind of creative tension, as different people, groups, communities hold different views and priorities based on both our historical understandings and ideas about what the future should or could look like. I love this kind of phrase that as a society, we must live with the things that are not yet past, and how we relate to our environment is an interesting and contested example of that. So I think it's really interesting that Scotland today, and really from the 18th century, has been predominantly or developed into a predominantly urban country. And yet rural and environmental issues and the politics of land exercise many Scots, rural and urban, and heavily influence public debate and policy at Holyrood. We can point to lots of examples here, whether that's access and the right to roam, energy and wind farm construction, national park creation and management, and of course the land reform agenda and kind of community land ownership legislation. So why is this? And I think it's interesting that following a pattern we can see globally, how the urban developed from the rural, so we all are rural people at heart and retain a stake in its past and its future. In Scotland in particular, rural places are a major and complex element of national identity, which in turn is informed by and fractured along regional and local identity lines as well. I think that as a result, Scotland's political parties know not to ignore rural issues, many of which are, of course, historically rooted, particularly those related to land use, the ownership of land and access to it and the resources it brings. Scottish politics has grappled with the gnarly questions of land reform since the 1880s, and continues to do so today within the context of climate and biodiversity crises, adding a new urgency to that debate. So I think historically, rural Scotland has always been a space for experimentation, for revolution, innovation and conflict. It is not peripheral to those forces, it is central to them. And I think that's why historical perspective can be beneficial, particularly actually when set into the much longer timescales utilised by the scientific community. Of course, that comes with its own challenges. History is by definition open to interpretation, and competing historical analyses can and have been mobilised to support particular contemporary agendas. There are other dangers too. History can be used to exclude or other individuals or groups, potentially reinforcing unequal power dynamics further. I think as a society, we need to be alert to how power is translated, and much of that is historically constructed, and the nature of past exclusions on economic, social, cultural grounds to avoid replicating similar dynamics today. Of course, this makes it an interesting time and area in which to be a historian, and I do think history can be part of the dialogue and solutions. History, I think, shows us that the means are as important as the ends when it comes to change, whether those ends are societal, environmental, or political. And I think that an honest, inclusive and wide-ranging public debate, such as this supported in this series, is critical to developing that constructive way forward, as is recognising that the rural is not a monolithic place or experience. I think I will leave it there.
Thank
Sarah,
you so much, Annie. I was just about to cough. So you're absolutely spot on your 5 minutes. Thank you so much. And you've set a challenge for our next introduction from Professor Pat Monaghan. Over to you, Pat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to take part in this. And I'd also like to thank all the people who are listening. Scotland is a beautiful country. It's full of mountains, glens, tumbling rivers. Land itself is largely rural, although most people live in urban areas. It's important to remember that our landscape and our ecology has very much been shaped by history. So Annie's perspective on history is very important. We're living in a people-created country in many aspects, but we're facing two crises that we, humanity, have brought upon ourselves: climate change and biodiversity loss. Our nature is depleted and our climate is warming. And in Scotland, although it's a beautiful country, we're one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And we must remember that. Now, our government has set ambitious targets. It's set to reach net zero by 2045 in the hope of helping to combat climate change. When it comes to biodiversity, we signed up to the 30 by 30 targets, which is that 30% of the land and seas should be managed for nature by 2030. Now, 23% of our land is already conserved legally. So does that mean we can feel optimistic and that we are on track? And I think the answer to that, sadly, is no. Obviously, we have a legacy of how our land is used, which has come from the agrarian and industrial revolutions in the late 18th and 19th century. These have damaged our climate, and that's accelerated more recently and damaged our nature. Our agriculture became much more intensive and increasingly more dependent on chemicals for fertilization, for pest control, more livestock facing, but importantly, less diverse. The Industrial Revolution brought, of course, many changes, but not least of which has been the excessive use of fossil fuel. This sort of almost industrial approach has extended to even up to our uplands in the way in which the land is managed. We have habitats that have been artificially held back, artificially constructed to support sometimes very intensive use of the land for, say, a driven grouse shoot, keeping numbers of birds way higher than they would occur in nature, or for deer stalking. And when nature gets in the way, historically, we've been rather ruthless in dealing with it, and our approach has to be eradicated. And therefore, we're faced with this biodiversity crisis. Now, we've got to do something about carbon capture and storage. The most important thing we can do there now is to reduce our use of fossil fuels and to reduce our emissions. And we must not get fooled into thinking that in order to store and sequester carbon, we should manage the land in such a way that we drive out nature even further. We've got to be very careful then. So I think there are things that we need to have a hard look at. We need to have a hard look at how we use the land, whether we can use it more for production of biofuels and so on. We need to bring in more diversity and less intensity to our farming. Move away from this monoculture approach. We need to address the problems in our uplands. The deterioration of our peatlands is bad for biodiversity. It's also bad for carbon storage. We need to get our policies right in forestry. We must not allow more monoculture to come in there too. We need to protect our soils. We have no legislative framework for that. We need to deal with non-native invasive species. These are a big problem for us. But we also need to make our rural environment somewhere where people can live and thrive. And that is also very important. We are part of nature and we need to thrive too. So that's my take.
Thank you
For the
so
moment.
much. Thank you so much, Pat. That's very provocative. Both presentations have been provocative, and that's the purpose of this, to have a debate for the next wee while, just over half an hour. So the questions have started coming in. There's one each for Annie and Pat. Firstly, Annie, as a society, you've said we're always living with the things that are not yet past, and somebody's picked up on that. And this includes historical, cultural perspectives on Scotland's rural environment. Where can history play a part in creating an inclusive dialogue that you mentioned about the future? What's the role of history in taking this dialogue in a constructive way forward? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's a really brilliant question, which is, you know, it's that challenge, isn't it, that not just talking about principles, but how does this actually work? So my experience in working across rural places is that individuals and communities and organisations there are very aware of their histories and their heritage, not just of their own organisations, but of their place. And that's because history is a key part of identity building and therefore a key part of thinking about the future and what those places could or should be, which might be the same as or different to what they have been in the past. So to take examples from Pat's brilliant opener there, you know, whether it's a traditional agricultural area, for example, or whether there's been forestry there for a long time, or fishing, or whatever it might be. I think that talking through historical legacies and historical issues can be a way to have quite interesting, not confrontational, but honest dialogues about what needs to change for the future, and how people see themselves as part of that change. So it can be a way to include a wider and diverse range of people as possible in decision making, that relates to particular areas or particular issues like renewables, for example. So I think that history is a way. It's a bit of a. Of course, history is not neutral, but it's a space in which people can talk about the present and future in a way that can be more constructive, or potentially a bit more informed about where different stakeholders and communities are coming from when faced with a decision about land use change, for example. So it's about understanding and meeting people and communities where they are. And that is fundamentally informed by what the history is, essentially.
Great, thank you very much, Annie. I've got a question for Pat, and then another question which either of you can pick up. We'll see who fights for that one, gets in first. So Pat, somebody's here has an interest in midges, in fact, and obviously your work around the impact of land use changes on species. They ask, why should we care if some species like midges, which are pests, actually go extinct? We could do with fewer insects all round to make the countryside nicer to live in. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I understand, of course, why midges aren't popular. It's people, they bite us. And beware, it's only the females who bite. But midges are an integral part of the ecosystem. We may find them annoying. Remember, they're not carrying serious infectious diseases for us. They're not like mosquito carrots that carry malaria. Many animals feed on midges. Many of our ecosystems rely on midges. If you're looking at swallows or swifts or bats, remember that they need midges in order to thrive, as do many animals need them in the aquatic environment. So we shouldn't hate midges. We might not like them. But insects in general, and also spiders and so on, many invertebrates, are a really important and much neglected part of our ecosystems. There's been a huge decline in insects across the world, and that is very bad news for our ecosystems, because they are very important indeed for ecosystem stability. and ecosystem resilience. So smile at the midges and be glad. Be glad that they're there, but that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't take steps to avoid them, of course.
Thank you so much. Smile at the midges. I'm sure people will store that away for this summer. So thank you. We have more questions coming in now, so I'll do my best to get through them. And one thing that will help that is we don't feel both of you have to answer all questions. So I'll put them out and then you decide who will answer. So this is from James Curran. Many, perhaps most people, think our Scottish landscape of empty heather moorlands is wild, beautiful and natural. How do we change that belief, which maybe hinders beneficial change? Yeah, Annie?
Do you want me to pop it? Just maybe, and I'm sure Pat has a view on this as well. I think when we talk about those perceptions of Scotland's landscapes, what we're really talking about is a kind of early to late Victorian romantic ideal of Scotland. And not just in a Scottish context, but a European romantic ideal, which you see in other places like the Lake District as well, and parts of mainland Europe. And that's been an incredibly durable stereotype or image of Scotland. And in many ways, it has brought numerous benefits and rewards, I suppose you could term, in terms of our tourist industry, in terms of our heritage industry, etc. But obviously, as kind of Pat's made the point, these aren't natural landscapes in any way. They're man-made, created landscapes around this romantic ideal. So one answer to that question, James, might be about helping people to understand how those landscapes were constructed and why, and who benefited from those over time.
Thank you so much. Pat, do you want to add to that, or shall we move on?
I agree with what Annie said. So you can, I mean, James says in his question, I see that they're empty, they're barren. That's because many of the potential predators of the species that they're being managed for have been driven out. The other reason some of them are barren is the enormous densities of deer that we have in this country, which prevent woodland regeneration. And that is a big issue and something that hopefully will be tackled in the Natural Environment Bill.
Thank you for bringing in mention of that too as well, Pat. Thank you both for that. The next question is from Alistair Jeffs. Hello, how do you overcome the strong backlash of those who consider themselves insiders and have the right to manage the land as they see fit, and many believe they do that successfully? I'm thinking of the SWT purchase of the Loch Broom estate, for example. Annie.
Start that. It's a really interesting question, Alistair. I've been considering that purchase as well. I think what's interesting is that because of the history and legal structures in Scotland, land ownership automatically translates to quite a large degree of freedom over land management and use, at least historically. We have policy frameworks in place like the rights and responsibilities statement, etc. So there's not a completely free hand, but it is still relatively free. And as a result, major charities like the wildlife trusts like John Muir Trust or National Trust for Scotland have used land purchase as a way to advance their particular agendas, which might be really positive in many kinds of ways. But I suppose that when you pick up that point about the backlash, it's about means, not just the ends. And so that backlash is really around, I suppose, concerns over the role that individuals or communities should be playing in those decisions, in those kind of management decisions, but currently aren't, because of, unless the charity is highly committed to community working and consultation, etc. But at the end of the day, if they own the land, then they can still decide how it's used and managed. And there are certainly hierarchies and, I suppose, not opaque cultures of decision making. I suppose that is a bit of is to some extent a historical legacy of the nature of land ownership in this country. So I think it's up to those new landowners to address that head on, and to potentially set up structures which allow for dissent, which allow for debate and dialogue, while they are trying to progress their own objectives as well.
Thank you so much. Pat, do you want to come in on this, or wait till the next?
Just a little bit. I mean, I think one thing we mustn't do is allow history to define our future. And we've come forward in Scotland. There has been land reform, and hopefully there's going to be more. We have to get used to the idea that we need to protect the natural environment. That includes people. People also use the environment, and organisations, landowners, charities, local communities need to work together to make it work. There'll be competing interests, of course. Surely we can get those reconciled and get an optimal, if not best outcome, but an optimal outcome for most interested parties.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions around definitions and responses to different policy signals. Ian McLean is asking, do the speakers have any views on the present tax regime and how it might be improved? For example, end agricultural derating, land value tax. So big questions there for you. Would either of you like to take this one on, bearing in mind we have to finish in 20 minutes? 25 minutes.
I'll refrain from a 90-minute lecture on the history of taxation regimes. And it's a fundamental question, and it has been taxation reform as a historical question has been around for a very long time, and we have seen some significant tax reform in the past 100 years in particular, but never a kind of single land tax as such. I think tax, it's one of the most powerful levers that government can pull in terms of trying to direct change. But as we've seen in with the new Labour government at Westminster, it's also a blunt instrument as well. So I think that certainly there's a huge amount of room to reform the current tax regime, depending on what those outcomes might be. It might have an effect of I suppose deterring new large landowners, for example. It might kind of push us in certain policy directions. Certainly in the early 20th century, tax, it was actually through income tax, the super tax as it was known under David Lloyd George's 1909 budget, had a very powerful impact, not just on landowners' finances. It did, but it actually had more of an impact on their kind of outlook and relative pessimism, optimism about their own powers and their place in their changing place in society. So I think there's a big debate to be had around that, and it'll certainly not be a new debate either.
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to add that importantly, our tax regime has to be fair. And when we have tax concessions, they must also be applied wisely. And I think in Scotland, we need to have a very close look at the tax concessions that we allow for commercial forestry. This is part of the Royal Society of Edinburgh report that I was part of. We have to ensure that these concessions, which of course are public money that we don't get, are used wisely. And currently, they're not being used wisely, which is why private equity firms are buying up land in Scotland in order, it's marketed as a tax-efficient investment, in order to use it often for planting trees and gaining further tax benefits down the line. So we need to have a close look at the tax area, I think.
If I could follow up with you, Pat, there's a question here that you might feel you've answered already, but do elaborate, from Tom Gray. Very few people own a significant hectareage of land in Scotland. Do you think a land tax should be established to disincentivise vast private land ownership?
Well, as probably everybody who's listening knows, our private land ownership is very concentrated in Scotland. Few people few private individuals own a lot of the privately owned land, Sometimes they're managing it wonderfully, sometimes they're not. But the majority of us don't own a lot of land. So the premise of the question is correct. Again, I come back to what I said. We need to ensure our tax system is fair, that those who have most end up paying most. But also, we have to bear in mind stewardship, what it gives to the public, what it gives to the community, if certain tax concessions are allowed. I don't know enough about the land taxation system, but I guess it does need to be looked at quite carefully. But we certainly need to keep an eye on land ownership, and private equity firms are driving up the price of land in Scotland. And I think the third or fourth major private landowner in Scotland is Gresham House, which is a private equity firm in it for making money, not for providing services.
So a corollary of that, or a counterbalance to that, is the theme that's coming through in a number of questions from Neil Dawson, Vanessa Hallhead and Mike Danson around community land ownership. I'll read out their questions briefly. Do the speakers agree that advancing community land tenure on a large scale is critical for social, cultural and ecological restoration? And if so, what are the main mechanisms for that to happen? And excuse me while I scroll down. Vanessa Hallhead says the elephant in the room is always land tenure. Andy Whiteman's website is very sobering about who owns Scotland. This removes the ability of us all to influence land use and community development. And Mike Danson has commented on the Community Land Scotland report, confirms breaking private and public monopolies into community ownership, use or management leads to social, economic and environmental improvement. So what are the barriers? So a couple of people wanting to explore that theme a wee bit. So any thoughts on that from a historical perspective, or indeed from your perspective, Pat, that you were just elaborating on? Who would like to start?
Do you want?
You go ahead, Annie.
Go ahead, Annie.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I can kind of go back and build on something that I was saying about the kind of romantic ideal of Scottish land. So one of the outcomes of Scotland, rural Scotland, becoming the heart of the European Romantic project is that the value, I mean, the economic and financial value of Scottish land has been very high in the past. So and the Scottish land market, particularly the way it's been arranged into estates, has been very attractive to a global plutocracy from the early 19th century. So we can see this in patterns of land purchase from as early as the 1830s, as the profits from enslavement and the slave trade were used to purchase land in Scotland, to kind of industrial plutocrats from all over the globe, a pattern which still kind of continues. It's kind of an interesting reflecting back to those questions about, could a land tax decentivize this? I mean, some of these plutocrats are so rich, there's no tax really that could be applied, I think, that could really put them off. And so I think, so that the cost of land, so whether that's for communities looking to purchase land and assets at very high prices, even supported by the public purse. That is one of the kind of key barriers. That's a historical, cultural perception of Scottish land and what it means and what it gives the owner in terms of cultural status and a kind of global cachet. And that's kind of making it very hard to change. I certainly think that a more diverse range of landowning types is absolutely essential in the Scottish land market, and a kind of a better balance between different kinds of landowners, and maybe breaking down that concentration of land as well is going to be kind of crucial to that. But that may have implications on the ecological and environmental side if there's kind of landscape scale restoration work that would need multiple agreements, agreement across multiple landowners. I'm sure it can be done, and it is being done elsewhere in the world, not just Europe, but in South America, for example. So I think that there's a powerful cultural kind of set of values that sits behind that type of land ownership that we need to sort of really kind of dissect and address if we want to change the structures.
Well, if I could just come in there, I mean, part of the question was about community buyout.
Mm-hmm.
Community buyout, if it can happen, is inherently a good thing. If people have a stake in their, not just in their local community, but in the local land, they will want to see it managed wisely. And facilitating that is something that the government has been trying to do, but it needs to be managed wisely and appropriately. And also in Scotland, we have quite a lot of access to the land. We have the right to roam legislation, which is a wonderful thing. But again, people need to be careful with the land. They need not to misuse it. They shouldn't be throwing litter all over it, which is one of the rather desperate things you see in the Scottish countryside, that a lot of people have little respect for the land, and somehow, somewhere in our education system, we're getting that wrong, and we need to try to get it right so that people see the land not as a place to dispose of stuff in, but as something to cherish and look after, whether it's, you know, woodland or whatever kind of land it is. It's important. Giving communities a stake is also important.
Thank you very much. We're going to change tack slightly and look at climate change and global warming, the different aspects of that. And we have questions from Colin, Jack and Andrew Midgley in that regard. So Colin asks, we can't stop global warming, but we can prepare for it. Migration of species is a result, including humans. Can we get a plan to create pathways to support the migration? And related to that, Andrew asks, while facing a common issue, climate change, we are often socially fractured and polarized on land management issues. How can we address polarization and get on the same page? So I guess in order to think of pathways, we need to get on the same page and address polarization. So what are your thoughts, both of you, on that in the context of climate change?
I mean, climate change is a huge issue which we are facing globally, but it's intertwined with the biodiversity crisis also. The biodiversity is also a tool that helps us protect ourselves against climate change. However, one of the questions at least was asking about movement of species. People and other species will move as more and more land becomes unsuitable for what is required of it by that particular species. We will see, and we're seeing it already coming into our country. For example, the question about midges earlier on, we're probably quite soon going to have many more mosquitoes, and they will bring a completely different dimension to how we think about flying insects in our country. You know, they will quite possibly can bring with them more diseases. So we do need to prepare ourselves. We need to prepare our forests for climate change. We have to ensure that trees we're planting now are going to be resistant to the extreme weather conditions that are coming down line. We need to think about what are the appropriate species? Will we lose some of our native species? Should we be thinking about other species that we might consider bringing in order to replace some of those that won't cope with the different conditions? Yes, we need to think about it, but also we need to be extremely careful. And an important thing here is that we need diversity. As soon as you have monocultures, you become very susceptible to changes in weather, to diseases coming in. We should never have our forests denuded of diversity, and that's important. But we've been trying in this country to manage many non-native invasive species or manage species that are native but are in the wrong place. That's also very controversial, but it's something that we have to face up to, and there's going to be an increasing number of species moving in, and we're going to have to find ways of welcoming those that we want and dealing with those that are bringing us big problems, because we're going to have both.
Okay. Annie, do you want to add that around the polarisation, a historical perspective, or anything
Yeah, maybe
else?
just to pick up Andrew's question there. Yeah, I think that to address that polarisation, we need to sort of, I think, have a bit of an honest discussion about the social or power inequalities that sit behind land management decision making, and that what sits behind that is land ownership itself. So it's about, people might be able to agree on a positive land management change, which will address or mitigate climate change impact, or picking up on some of the examples Pat was giving there. But maybe they can't agree on the unequal power balance of the land management and ownership that sits behind that decision. So it's really potentially about, if not changing the mechanics of land ownership, we have a legislative program behind that, we have community ownership, etc. So that's kind of in train to some extent, but maybe it's about putting down some fundamentals and expectations, maybe some frameworks about land management. So no matter what the ownership type, and maybe having that more grounded in these urgent crises of climate change and biodiversity loss that Pat's talking about.
Thank you.
Just to come back to also the climate change issue, we mustn't forget that the most important thing we need to do is cut down our emissions, cut down our use of fossil fuels. And it's very worrying to see the movement away from renewable energy by companies like BP. This is a bad thing. We need to get back on track with that. We need to appreciate that changes in land use and its contribution to climate change is not going to solve it. It will make a relatively small contribution. But here in Scotland, one of our biggest resources in that context are our peatlands, and we have to restore them and allow the carbon to be captured and remain. And that's what a carbon store is about. And our peatlands are great for that. And remember that even a 30 centimetre depth of peat, hectare for hectare, is holding as much carbon as a hectare of a tropical rainforest. So think about that carefully when you think, that bogs and peatland are just barren habitats, and they're also full of biodiversity. So we need to get that land management right also.
So bringing us back to land management, thank you, Pat. And Annie, you mentioned land management frameworks, whether you own the land or not. That relates to a question here, which I think is trying to disaggregate things a little bit. Oh, my screen has just jumped. Sorry, I had it positioned there. There we go, it's come back. So a question from Alistair Jeffs: is the behaviour of the landowner more important than ownership itself? And the example given here is managing it for the benefit of society and the local community. Is it that we're getting at here, rather than ownership, or not? What's your answer to that provocation?
Yeah, and I appreciate the sort of disentanglement of those two things, but I think the history of land ownership in Scotland means that it's almost impossible to disentangle that, actually. Attempts to kind of manage or kind of provide a policy framework for land management can often turn into kind of very bureaucratic exercises, burdensome kind of red tape exercises, without actually maybe achieving the kind of radical ends that we need to change our land management practice for the kind of collective benefit of humanity, essentially. I think in principle you can. It doesn't, in a sense, there'd be this world where it doesn't really matter who the landowner is. It could be a hedge fund, it could be an aristocrat, it could be a charity, but the land management practice or framework would mean that the land is managed in a beneficial way. But I think we're quite a distance away from that at the moment. And it could be, there's an argument to be made that the historical debate about land reform has been a bit of a distraction. Or you could argue it's absolutely essential to making the changes we need.
Yeah, I'd like to come in there, because I often feel uncomfortable about prioritizing benefits for humanity over everything else. And I think we have to get away a little bit from seeing nature as something that is ours to exploit. And we should start to try to think about a more cohesive and inclusive approach to ecosystems of which we are a part. So if we're talking about managing land for local communities, that has to also include the other animals, plants and microorganisms, soil organisms and so on that are part of that. We need to manage the land in order to have a healthy ecosystem of which we are a part. We don't stand outside it, we're dependent on it, but other species depend on it too. And we need to care about that. One thing that troubles me is that many people don't care. And I think we have to try to get back to an ethos where we care about nature and we make space for nature, because we also are part of it and depend on everything else that's part of nature. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a barren planet. It'll be brown and we'll be just sitting there looking at each other and some technology that's keeping us alive. And I don't find that a very attractive prospect.
Thank you so much, Pat and Annie. And Pat, you mentioned the word ecosystem there, and there's a couple of elements of that around water and soil that people have been picking up and would like your perspectives on. Kalsi Tarot asks, any expertise on the land use changes from the industrial age? Are water issues left behind? So how do we continue to think about water as a resource? And Colin Jack says agriculture is changing. Most of Scotland's uplands are considered to have poor soil, and this probably relates to what you're saying, Pat, are considered to have poor soil, but when you drive through the Carse of Gar is rich soil, the crops are grown above ground. Apply to the glens is the question mark. So something around soil and around water, what are your perspectives on those as part of the ecosystem and their prioritisation?
Well, shall I go first? We have a lot of water in Scotland as well as land. In the I'm not thinking about our seas. We have a lot of fresh water, and our freshwater environments are also very important, and they have been strongly influenced by human agency. For example, many of our rivers have had dams and weirs put in them that inhibit the movement of species. They're no longer necessary, but we don't have the money to remove these weirs to allow fish to move up the rivers again. There's a lot of things in that, in our, how we want. It depends on what we want our country to look like, really, and how we want to shape it, because it's in our hands what happens. So, yes, water is extremely important, and we've been polluting it, and we've been using it, and we need to sort it out. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Annie?
I mean, maybe kind of an overarching theme here as well is a lot of what we're talking about, and not just the environmental issues, the degradation, the barrenness that Pat's been talking about in terms of land or water or all of our kind of natural environment, but maybe our kind of political and societal issues is kind of a result of Scotland being, saying one of the world's first industrializing nations, and that was including kind of approaches to agriculture. But I suppose that kind of capitalist imperial kind of extractive outlook as well. So, so we look at our landscapes in terms of what they can produce in terms of energy, in terms of food, in terms of all kinds of things that are essential to us, mining. It's kind of an extractive mentality that, so really to address that, we need to, I think very carefully and confront some hard truths as a society about, and we're talking about hundreds of years here, not just recent. I mean, we've got a kind of recent examples of how this tendency is expressed, but I think that there's a big conversation there about what kind of society we want to be.
And just the question that you asked also mentioned soils. We do not have a legislative framework in Scotland to protect our soils. Many other or some other countries anyway do. We did get as far as looking into that, and then nothing happened. And soils are what on, such an important and much neglected part of our ecosystem. And we have in Scotland what I think is the wonderful James Hutton Institute that knows a lot about soils. And we are in a good place to have a framework to protect soils, and we need to get our act together with that, both in legislative terms and in determining what it is we want. And the speaker had said, looking at the uplands, the soils are all poor. Depends on what you mean by poor. They might be poor for growing certain crops, but there is a diversity of soils in Scotland, and that should be welcomed. And again, we need the right policies in place to protect them.
Thank you so much. And there are many more questions, including around ecosystem services and paying for those as well. And that's another dimension. Unfortunately, it's now 10 to 1. And not unfortunately, because we have Professor Roger Crofts, who's going to give us 5 minutes, 5 points in 5 minutes. Roger, that challenge is over to you. Thank you.
I wish this could go on all afternoon. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And thank you all. Right, let's start off. Nuanced views. It's very easy to say that when we're talking about contested rural environments, it's a simple black and white, but it isn't that at all, is it? It's much more subtle from a culture, societal, historical perspective. We also know that we must build in the urban perspective as well. This is not a purely rural issue, as we've often thought of it in the past. And we also need to bear in mind the changes that humans have wrought over time. We've touched on that in these debates, quite fundamental changes, so that we've ended up in places like in the uplands with arrested successions, although there's still some scientific debate on that sort of thing, which we didn't touch on today, but we might do. So this means that nature is not separate from people. I know there's an ongoing debate about that, but I mean, I think what we're all saying, that they're intrinsically interwoven. So what we're saying, this is a very, very complex area. And this is why it's so difficult to actually make real progress on, which I think is reflected in what the questions have been saying. There are two perspectives that come out quite neatly flowing from that. I mean, one is the historical perspective. I love Annie's phrase, it's a present reality. And I think you meant also a future validity and resonance as well, because that's so important. We don't forget that. I mean, I don't think I've heard today the classic terms of traditional knowledge, but that's an experience. But that's what we're talking about, and how that can help to inform the dialogue at present and into the future, and to enable us at the same time and alongside that, these objective assessments of the changes that have happened to our land, but more fundamentally, what those causes are. And we need that if we're going to plan for this uncertain future as a result of economic and social changes, but also the climate change and the uncertainties of that, and turning around a biodiversity crisis. Then we get on to the very knotty question, and we can't get away from this. How do we decide on land ownership? I mean, nobody's mentioned the word, but it's a total free-for-all here in Scotland. Other countries now have mechanisms. Can we use the tax regime? Well, I think, Annie, you made it pretty clear that that's very difficult. We've been working on that for many, many years. And I love the phrase that the historical debate on ownership has perhaps been a bit of a distraction. I'm going to nail my colours to the mast. I think it is as well, because I think we've not had enough discussion, and it's flowed out today neatly, but not in the political realms, of the ethics of management and stewardship. And that's really quite few right at the forefront, really. So that then therefore brings on the next point is, well, how do we deal with polarization? Oh my gosh. We have not dealt with conflict resolution at all well. And we've seen that, we have I'm not summarising now, but I'm going to comment that last year we had a natural, an Agricultural Rural Communities Act, and this year we're getting a Natural Environment Act. Is this the same country, the same ballpark at all? We're not learning to deal with that, and we haven't moved on from the shouting at each other from prepared positions and rigid perspectives to, Annie, you used a lovely phrase, honest dialogues, and I think that's what we really need to have, but that needs facilitation. We haven't got it at the national, local or regional levels, which, final point then, planning for future land uses, we've got to think about whole systems here in nature. I love, Pat, your answer on the midge being an important part of the food web, of the natural food web, not the human one, perhaps, that we need to think about the ethical bases, which brings in the points being made about not monocultures, but diversity, because we know that that helps in terms of disease prevention in nature. We need to think about planning for translocation of species, whether they're species that are not here yet or those that have been deliberately hunted out. And we've had some successes on that. We haven't mentioned them today, but they're there. And we need to think about how we naturalize things, but without taking people out of the equation, because it's the people and nature together that will help to reduce the conflict. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Roger. That's an unenviable task for anybody, but Roger is well positioned given his, I was going to say his long time in the field, but I don't mean that to be, I mean that to be a compliment, Roger. So I did challenge our speakers when we met previously to come up with one single takeaway point, which you have just 1 minute max to elaborate on. So Annie, I see you've unmuted, so you're going to go first.
Oh dear. I think I'm going to go back, and Roger kindly picked up on it as well, is about and use that phrase for conflict resolution on some of our land issues in Scotland. We need to have more of this honest debate with clear-eyed as possible, underpinned by knowledge from all of our different disciplines, all of our perspectives, all of our lived experiences. To level the playing field of that debate. Because without that, decisions, as we've seen, decisions can be made for all the right intentions, but it's about bringing the community and society along with those decisions and giving them a part in it.
Thank you so much, Annie. Pat, in 1 minute or less, please.
Well, I guess being in less than 1 minute, I think one of the things we need to turn around is how people think about the natural environment. We need to get people to stop thinking, what can we get out of nature? But rather, how can we live more harmoniously within the natural environment without destroying it?
Thank you so much, Pat. Well, I'd like to pull the meeting to a close now. Firstly, thanking those of you online, because this discussion would have been a lot poorer without you. So thank you very much for all your questions, and we have them here in the chat. Thank you to our speakers, our three professors, Pat, Annie and Roger. And just to remind you that this and all the other sessions will be on the RSE's YouTube channel. So do tune in, keep the debate going on this channel and elsewhere, and do tune in again to the RSE. Thank you so much everyone for your time, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.